All right. This is not a podcast. This is just a talk between Greg Souders, Mike Israetel, and me. Sponsored by the Jiu Jitsu company. I'm hosting it at my school right now, but they're all over the world. Do you guys want to quickly introduce yourselves and then we'll get started?
Yeah.
Greg?
All right. I'm Greg Souders. I'm a jiu-jitsu coach out of Rockville, Maryland. I run a program called Standard Jiu-Jitsu, and we specialize in using the constraints-led approach for training our athletes.
I'm Mike Israetel. I'm a black belt under Josh Vogel at the Jiu Jitsu company, even though I live in Michigan. And it's just so cold here. So damn cold here right now when we're recording this. And I'm
What's the
full of
temperature?
sadness. And that really is, I think, what I have to say about myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for ruining this entire experience, Mike, with your
But
darkness.
I thought I was ruined. I'll try to cheer up. It's so cold, you guys. It's terrible.
How cold is it?
-1 last night.
Oh,
Fuck.
that's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
man.
It's like 22 degrees here, and the app says it's supposed to feel like 4 degrees. It just feels like shit. I don't know where
Yeah.
you are. -1.
That makes sense.
All right, guys. Greg, you suggested when we were talking that a good starting point would be to kind of define what ecological dynamics is. Which one of you guys wants to take that first? Do you want to say what your thoughts on it are, Mike, the definition, and then maybe
No,
Greg,
I'd
your perspective?
I'd love to hear from Greg.
No.
He's the guy.
I've said this so much, it kind of makes me crazy because, when we're talking about this stuff, we're talking about it at two different levels. We're talking about the idea of where the phrase came from and then how that phrase turned into the method we now use, which is CLA. So every time I try to explain it, people get mad at me because they're like, what does that even mean? You pedantic asshole, you pretentious bitch. Um, but no, the ecological dynamics is just a theory around how complex systems organize. Uh, from one state to another state, and the specifically we're talking about human movement. We're talking about how individuals perform tasks in environments, and through the interaction of those three things, behavior comes out. And within that thing, we have an idea about perception that we say that perception is direct, meaning that as organisms interact with perform a task in their environment, they get the information they need to act directly from their interaction. Direct perception basically means that it doesn't need to be interpreted, that the information out there is not impoverished, that it has everything we need to use it to organize our behaviors from one thing to another or into a thing itself. And this is opposed to other views of perception that suggest that the information goes in the brain and it gets reorganized into something usable. And then that representation that's created is what we use to act out on reality. So, again, ecological dynamics is just a framework that tries to explain all this craziness and how it interacts.
And then constraints-led approach would be like a tool that you could use to apply that to sport or to other
Yeah.
training tools.
Yeah, it's just the idea that we need to keep perception and action coupled, since they constantly affect each other. And if we assume perception is direct, then by keeping the organism acting in environments, we get exactly what we want from the behavior. Like the behaviors we do are directly linked to what's happening in the environment and vice versa. It's just this continuous interaction that can't be separated or decoupled. It's always happening. CLA just takes that into account and creates practice. This is a tool we use to create practice around it.
Cool. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Greg, that sounds very interesting. How would you say it differs from traditional training, or at least much of the traditional training we see in jiu-jitsu?
Well, for traditional training, there's just no framework for why people move. It's just a field of assumptions. It's like, oh, we want our behaviors to be automatic and implicit. So if we repeat them over and over and over and over again, then they'll become that. And the way that we traditionally access this is through rote repetition or static drilling or uchi komis in judo or something where we're repeating a pattern over and over and over and over again with the assumption that through the repeating of this pattern, we will acquire that pattern as an automatic skill. Or at least that's the base assumption. I mean, traditional is when we say the traditional approach, we just mean an approach without any framework, like no reason or logic behind why we do one thing or another.
Do you think that's well represented in like the average modern jiu-jitsu training school, or do you think it's like some weird Gracie stuff from the 1950s?
No, you get all different types of practice in all different types of gym. People that more heavily rely on full sparring, gyms that more heavily rely on situational sparring, gyms that heavily rely on verbal instruction or static repetition. You get a mixture of it all. So again, I don't know what the optimal mixture is and where the line is between traditional approach or not. But the idea that I'm sort of fighting against is that the way we think we learn skills traditionally is not the way we learn skills. That verbal instruction and static drilling, which are heavily used to convey information, are not as effective as other forms of training or other training interventions.
Okay. Do you think they have some effect, or some effect in some cases better than others? Or do you
Well,
think they're like categorically worse effect than alternative methods that you're proposing?
Well, yeah, yes, and no. I mean, that's a pretty big question. I think everything has an effect. Like one of my favorite quotes by Louis Simmons is "Everything works until it doesn't." And the question is like, where is that line, right? Where do we hit diminishing returns by doing anything? And is this thing that we're doing, whether we hit a diminishing return or not, having any effect on why the reason we're using it as an intervention? Like, well, so to simplify all that, my thing is this: when you drill statically, you get better at drilling statically. You don't get better at grappling or the skills that you don't develop the skills you would need to grapple in a live environment through static drilling. Again, static drilling is a thing in and of itself that makes you better at the thing in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that so if I can kind of recapitulate your position to you,
Yeah.
let me know if I get anything wrong. There's like an idea maybe a lot of folks hold that one of the best ways to learn jiu-jitsu is to hear the instructor reason through the positions he's going to teach you in a minute. And maybe he takes 10 minutes and maybe he tells a story about how he stabbed a guy who had a, cigar cutter coming after him. And somehow that makes sense. And then after he explains to you, like, this is why we do the neat cut pass. This is what the neat cut pass is. I want you guys to get some reps on it. He lets you do reps. Maybe he's attentive and helps you clean up your technique as you do them. Maybe he just walks around and talks to the other black belts and makes dick jokes, and maybe some combination. And then after that, 30 minutes or whatever, people drilling, he's like, all right, you guys feel good about this? And she's okay. And nobody says anything. And then he's like, okay, sweet. Let's go live. And he hits the clock, puts his mouthpiece in. So does everyone. And then there's kind of this assumption that like something that you learned in that move is going to somehow transfer to what you're doing live. And your position is like that transfer at the very least within a training session, and possibly even over weeks of training, is like at best questionable in efficacy, and at worst like a dog shit way to do things.
Well, both. Yeah.
Okay,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
yeah. Most people get good despite of the training methods used.
sure.
And so the question is what within the things we do create the greatest effect for learning? Um, and when we just show a move and have people drill it, and even if we situational spar, or even if we just go right to sparring, there's this massive assumption that talking and drilling will actually transfer, and that's the thing that I'm fighting against. And it's not just me fighting. This is actually something that's happening across bunch of different sporting domains across the world. We're trying to basically stop decontextualized learning. The science is starting to suggest that, man, there's a whole thing happening here, and that we can't parse out these bits that we'd like to if we want to develop true skill. We have to keep a lot of these bits together because it's about the relationships present in the environment that really induce learning, not how we separate them.
Okay, um, that makes a lot of sense. Would it be true for someone to say that like modern positional sparring and live rolling are a bit more nodding into the direction of the ecological approach, even if done not in the ideal way,
Well,
than like just static drilling?
well, for sure, absolutely. But we have to be careful when we say the ecological approach, because all we mean when we say that is that direct perception at some level is happening. That the information we're gaining from the things we're doing does not need to be interpreted by the brain. So that's all that when someone says an ecological approach, that's all they mean. They're not saying anything about sparring or situational sparring or CLA really. So everyone's throwing this word around, eco this, eco that. It's almost meaningless. Um, because really what we're just trying to do is implement CLA, which is a method that is informed by the idea of direct perception. But
CLA stands for what?
the constraints-led approach.
Constraints-led approach.
Yeah.
And this is when you say to someone, you're in this position, which is called topside half guard. You want to be in this position after, which is called side control. And your constraints are that you're allowed to use your hands and your feet. You can't bite people. And I want you to maybe have some more constraints on how you do this. And then when I set them up, I let you try to figure out what's going on and let your neural network pick up the slack. Is that, tell me how that's a misinterpretation.
Okay, so constraints are ever present. They're not just half guard to side control. That's just a task constraint, for example. Um, the constraints are, how you felt that morning. It's your body size compared to the body size of the guy that you're going against. It's the time on the clock. It's the level of fatigue in the system. The CLA is how to manipulate the constraints present in a given system. Typically, when you do jiu-jitsu practice, the only constraints that we're manipulating would be the position itself. So when we're talking about situational sparring, we're just talking about uh, constraint manipulation at the level of the stereotypical end states, like the definable thing of half guard or the definable thing of side control, and we're ignoring how body sizes affect each other, or how time is affecting this, or how fatigue is affecting this, or how all these other things that are affecting the outcome of this behavior. It's not just the positions. There's more to manipulate, and
Okay.
CLA is trying to figure out what constraints need to be manipulated to create the opportunity for some behavior to emerge that is positive as it relates to getting better at the things we do.
What's an example of how working the positional of passing someone's half guard would be handled by CLA versus
Mhm.
the modern approach of like, here's a way to do it. The guy's going to give you 50% resistance. Hit it, fellas.
Okay. Well, there's a lot because, like, even the way you just set that up, like, here's the half guard. We're going to be trying to solve it this way, and we're going to use 50%. Well, one is assuming that just calling it half guard has any value, and that it means something. So half guard is just an aesthetic. So it's not really telling us anything about the nature of the engagement. Um, the second thing is when we say something like "do it this way," what we're suggesting is that there's an optimal technique for solving the problem that you're facing. So we're constraining them in a very specific way to do a very specific movement pattern that might not tell the whole story for how we might even go about solving this problem. And then to say 50% is to assume that there is such a thing as 50% effort and that our words constrain it. So it's just a bunch of assumptions laid together. I mean, you might as well just say, here's half guard, go. That has the same value as everything you just said.
Greg, do you think that telling someone 50% effort has the identical value of telling them just to go, or is that a caricature of a position?
Well, the thing is everybody interprets what you mean by intense different ways. So, like, Joe's 50% is different than Tim's 50%. And other two guys there have no idea what you just said. So they ignored you. So they just go full bore. Like, you have no, if your words are the only intervention you have to constrain something like intensity, you are not sure what constrains intensity. So the CLA would go about trying to figure out what actually controls intensity, and we would use that as the measure to control intensity rather than just the words. Like, for example, you know that you do this every time you put weight on a bar. You know the relationship between your max effort and the weight on the bar is some measure of intensity, but you use a metric to do so. And so you know that you're doing something very intense based on what you understand to be your max capacity, for example. And you would select a percentage in that in a zone that would say, yo, this is intense relative to like your overall ability. But when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about skill, that's a line that's a little bit harder to define. We don't have the same level of metric or clean metric to do so.
Do you think unclean metrics that are a little bit rough around the edges but communicate some value have a place, or do you think any unclean metric, because it's unclean, is now sort of null of value and we shouldn't use it?
Oh no, no, I actually like rough around the edges. I love the gray area. I mean, I live in it. But if we're talking about optimizing training methods, we should probably look more deeply into something like intensity and how complex and continuous games can be manipulated to control the intensity, rather than just saying, "Hey, let's take our best guess." Now, because there will always be a gray area, even if we use something that we know controls intensity, like time, and we know that short time increases intensity and long time decreases intensity. Again, we can use that, but we don't get the whole picture, because let's say two guys are tired and we give them 3 minutes to do something, their fatigue just might make them approach the problem with a little bit less intensity. And even if we do the time, it doesn't control it perfectly. but it gets us closer to something that's real than just saying, hey, 50%.
Your hypothesis here, if you could let me know if I'm caricaturing it appropriately, is that giving folks 30 seconds to work and telling them nothing else versus giving them 3 minutes to work and telling them nothing else is a more dependable way of regulating how hard they're trying during that time than to say 50% or 25% or 90%.
Correct.
That's an interesting position. Okay, all right. And so it seems to me that a question I have is, how do you go about teaching someone who doesn't know any jujitsu how to do jujitsu to someone if they don't know like what moves to do at all? So, for
For sure.
example, if you're a purple belt, experienced, good, competitive, lots of time on the mat, purple belt and above, I can see how, because you already have a tree map in your head that's implicitly linked to your expression already of what move sequences to execute, and you have a good awareness of the three-dimensional space of possibilities of where to move, that you can use an approach that's very much rooted in sort of directly observing actions and reactions and continuing to iterate live. But if you're someone who's like a white belt or 6 months into white belt, and is it it seems to be tough for me, I just haven't thought this through probably, how do you use an approach that doesn't give folks an illustration of the common positions and the common actions that we take from some positions to get to better positions? Like standing, you can say, okay, you can experiment to how to submit someone while both people are standing. But actually, we found through like a lot of wisdom and inference from physics that if you're like on top of the person or if you're on bottom of them and you're no longer both standing, submission probability escalates quite highly. And so you say, okay, that's what derives the takedown or guard pull as kind of problem space squishing algorithms. They like reduce your problem space substantially from total mystery of like,
Yeah.
I'm just in front of this person, down to like, okay, I got to get them down on the ground. And then because we figured out there's a few decent ways to get someone to the ground, there's some
Yeah.
throws, there's some takedowns. If we teach a person those initial ideas, it's okay, we're going to teach you a few takedowns and it's all principles based, but you're going to have to know something so you can iterate on it. And maybe that'll get folks learning faster than if we sort of teach them nothing and have them ecologically explore for a lot of time. How would you respond to that sort of notion?
Well, it'd be hard because there's like 4 or 5 different assumptions in that you made in that single sentence. Um, so, I mean, first we have to start with the assumption that by telling people something, you give them information. That's just an assumption.
It's the
Because
assumption we're making here now, so it would invalidate the rest of our podcast if we didn't make it, I think.
no, no. So you're just no. I see what you mean. You're making an assumption that you need X to start X. Like you need to have some experience to explore or play. That's essentially what you asked. You're like with a purple belt who had a bunch of mind mapping, which again is an assumption. We don't even know if the mind maps in the way you're suggesting it. That's not something we understand. Um, and we're arguing that it doesn't. The brain doesn't map in the way you think it does, and that mapping is reinforced by repetition of behaviors that's given to us by verbal instructions. And again, these are all traditional views about how learning works. So the best way I can answer that for you is just you're asking about scaling. All pedagogies have a scale. How do I get someone who doesn't know how to engage? That's what you're really asking about. So we can and to like play your game, we can use the historical record. Absolutely, we have 3,000 years of grappling history, and we want a new person to start engaging in an effective way without having them reinvent the wheel. So let's say, for example, we know that in order for me to grab somebody's legs, I have to get their head and hands out of the way, and we know that. And we have new players who want to learn how to tackle people's legs. We constrain them to doing those behaviors. So we could play a simple game where one player's job is to get a hold of the other player's hands and keep them off of their body. The other player's job is to try to touch the other person. Simple as that. And that's an oversimplification, but I'm trying to clarify a point. That to start people learning new behaviors, they don't need to know a thing about the behavior. They just have to have something to do that would eventually lead them to the outcomes that we're trying to get them to perform, i.e., in this case, tackle legs. So
Okay.
all the time you would take to have them move around and talk is a waste. I could get people tackling legs in an hour without saying a thing about tackling legs.
I mean, I
So
could say Josh could get people to get tackling legs in 5 minutes by saying 2 minutes about how to do it, and then three about explaining some particulars. What makes an hour worth the time spending if we could just get to doing it within 5?
But you would imagine that it's the talking that does it.
We're talking and demonstrating, and then letting people try it, I guess. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that showing is better than telling, and telling is probably the least effective thing we can do. So showing somebody something is not wrong, and it's not separate from the ecological approach. Telling somebody to do something is not wrong, and it's not separate from the ecological approach. The ecological approach is just trying to keep perception and action directly linked. So whatever training intervention we use, we have to make sure it's live, so there's resistance present, that it's unscripted, meaning we don't know what's going to happen, and it's uncooperative, meaning we're actually fighting. So if we have a training intervention that at least has those three things, and both players know what their objective is, we're keeping the athlete coupled to their environment, where they're both working the physical capacity to do a thing, the skill to do a thing, and the decisions necessary to enact both those things all ever present. We're never separating those from each other.
Mm-hmm.
so one thought that I have is that if we're talking about brand new beginner people who are walking into a school for their first week, their first month, their first day of class, then there's like the skill development part of things. And then there's also a lot of social stuff that has to happen. So somebody who's not comfortable walking into a school for the first time, has anxiety, they come into class, and then they're partnered up with somebody that they don't know,
Yep.
then I would assume that if you're using purely an ecological or constraints-based approach for a beginner's class, then you have some way of breaking the ice.
Social interactions are a
Mhm.
constraint. The culture that's present at a gym constrains the individual socially. So you can have whatever measure you need to reduce the rate limiter of learning, if it is in fact a social one, by creating a more comfortable social environment to get people to start engaging. But not having them engage doesn't solve your problem.
Well, but what I
So
mean is that, like, by so for example, if we use technique as an icebreaker, where you have somebody who, okay, I'm going to have you partner up, Jess and Mike are going to partner up,
yeah,
and here's a technique. I want you guys to explore this a little bit together. And then they start working together. They get a couple reps. They start maybe cracking a couple jokes like, oh man, I can't remember where I was supposed to put my hand for this one. Like, which way do I go? And then the instructor comes in, gives a little bit of feedback. And then there's a little bit of rapport building that
yeah.
goes along with that, which then, when we eventually funnel into positional sparring later on or some sort of like live work, seems like it would make it an easier task than having somebody who's brand new working with somebody else who's brand new and they don't know each other and then they instantly go into some sort of live work. So I assume there's some sort
But
of like,
you're having them do live work when you're static drilling. You're having them touch each other, move each other, pull each other.
mhm,
You're setting up this false dichotomy, and this like it has to be done this way because of this thing. You're just making the example hyper specific to fit technique into it. Again, we're talking about scaling. So if you have someone that's so nervous that they can't move around with a little bit of resistance present, of course you might need to use a stronger intervention to help them work their social issues out. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Because if their rate of social interaction is a limiting factor for getting them to do live work, and they're so messed up socially they can't do it, yeah, it's going to affect their learning absolutely.
mhm.
But CLA takes that into account because the thing is we understand that everything constraints control everything. That context is everything. So we would use any method we would need to get behaviors to emerge. But the one thing that we don't compromise on is that things have to be coupled. You can't train a thing separate from the environment in which you're going to use it. It doesn't work.
You're saying like
So,
the
it,
example would then be
oh,
like,
sorry, go ahead, Josh.
sorry, Mike. Actually, you know what? No, you go ahead, Mike. I'm going to think this through a little bit better.
Sure. So I'll give you something, Greg, to see what your response is like, because this is really interesting stuff. You're saying that doesn't work,
Yeah.
but from my familiarity with the motor behavior and motor learning literature, it seems to be the paradigm that has developed over time seems to be one that assumes that it works and there seems to be lots of evidence for it working, and there's kind of like motor learning and actually just neural network reasons for it.
For what?
So
For what?
for breaking things down into techniques and working on those techniques individually,
It's
stacking.
called, that's from schema theory specifically, it's called part practice is what you're mentioning, but keep going.
So you take those individual techniques, then once the individual techniques are workable and it doesn't take a lot of cognitive overhead for you to make
Right.
them remotely sensible, you can stack them and sequence them into possibly like positions. So a couple
Right.
of techniques in a row. And then once you're competent in a few different positions, and especially if you have a coach like Josh, and he's been able to derive and weave with you a competent game plan that sequences those combinations, then you can sequence those into live training. And that at every single kind of training, if it's live versus its combination slash positional training versus if individual technique training, kind of have some upsides and downsides to them. And they're best run in a sequence from basic techniques to combinations to live over the course, potentially of one training session, maybe a week, definitely a month, for sure years, and even potentially a career span. And so, like, first you learn how to dribble, and then you learn how to shoot, or both in at some points. And then you can, once you know how to dribble statically, you can dribble dynamically.
No.
And then once you have basic techniques set up, you go through phases of integrating them into combinations, like just using the basketball example
Yeah,
of like,
I know what you're discussing. Yeah, but this is
like
all
run
wrong.
for sure. Well, sure, it might be. I'd be curious to hear how you put that. But so basically, once you've agglomerated enough basic techniques, which are kind of difficult to learn, and there's a lot of nuances in them.
Yeah, for sure.
Once you've agglomerated them, you can start to sequence them into meaningful actions on the court.
Right.
And then once you're a good tactical basketball player, then you can be layered with strategy. Because like if I tell you move the ball from this side of the court to the other side, but you don't know either how to dribble nor how to dribble plus run at the same time, I'm asking you for a problem that runs into like a mathematics situation.
You're talking about scaling again. You're just talking about scaling, and you're making assumptions about how to solve the scale. So to say that you need to know how to dribble before you dribble is actually, and I'm not saying, maybe you're just not realizing the circular reasoning that you're using. But we can't talk about a knowledge structure by using the idea of a knowledge structure. That's it's
Why not?
it's circular reasoning. If you need a knowledge structure to create a knowledge structure, where did the original knowledge structure come from?
From verbal instruction.
But where no, what I'm saying is if I need a knowledge structure in the brain to create a knowledge structure, where did the first knowledge structure come from?
From verbal instruction.
So you're
you're
saying that
you're able to
verbal and
verbally perceive things, and your world model that simulates human movement can visualize them for you,
so
and then you have a pre-primed world model of what that looks like. If Josh says you're going to duck your hips down, you're going to reach forward and grab someone's waist, you're going to pick them up, you're going to dump them to the side, I'm like, okay, I don't think I have this quite reasoned out, but it sure is better that I know that, and I kind of have a decent first guess as what I'm going to try with this person when I first grab him, versus if he would just told me nothing. So like, it is possible to convey knowledge to someone verbally and have them transfer that knowledge from verbal input down to motor cortices and then out the other way.
no. So at best,
You don't
verbal
think
and
that's possible?
it's not happening. I think that's a wild assumption about how learning works. I don't like there's no evidence to suggest that that's actually what's happening. Um, I mean, we would have to literally. You guys have computers in front of you right now. You could dig up papers if you wanted to, but so the idea that for example, I have to know how to dribble correctly to dribble is a silly thing because children do it all the time. They pick up a ball and they start playing with it, and
Yeah, but
dribbling
they're usually really
happens.
bad at it. That's why
Well,
they go to basketball camp.
well, yeah. So bad is not doesn't mean learning's not happening. Bad is does actually means learning's going on. So when we see messy behavior, that's a sign that learning is happening. So we
I don't think
on
that's true, Greg. It's a sign that messy behavior is happening. You could have underlying learning occurring, or you could have smaller amounts, or you could have no learning occurring. Like, messy behavior does not imply learning. The only thing that implies learning is sequentially measuring output on that given task and watching the escalating performance go
right,
up.
but we don't know the input output ratio because learning in our view is nonlinear. We don't know the input output ratio. So when you see something messing happening, you see coordination taking place. So by
I think
interacting
that's
with
the
your
opposite of true, Greg. There is no coordination when it's messy. There's maximum
correct,
coordination
because
when it's not
the
messy.
process of coordination is in fact a process. It's emergent. So if when I start doing a behavior, I have to attune to the information present. That's my capacity to say, in your case, dribble a ball. That's my sensation of grabbing a ball. That's the sensation of the ball hitting the floor and coming back to my hand, all relative to, again, my current capacities and what I'm using them for. And so there's a process of attuning to all this info while I'm trying to do something that looks like dribbling. And with enough variation over a certain period of time, if I continue to practice that as a thing, I start to coordinate a behavior that looks something like dribbling. And then over time, if it's done in a way that induces learning, it starts to stabilize into an ability.
Hmm.
And then we use that ability in different ways under different constraints to try to make it adaptable or resistant to perturbation or change. And so there's a process of inskillment, I guess, in the ecological approach that goes from attunement to coordination to control to adaptation. Um, and messy is what it looks like when it's in the process of happening.
Hmm. And so I guess the situation here from kind of training training a learning system that can move through an environment is this kind of maybe it's not two ends of a spectrum, but there's two primary ways to do it. One, and this is something they do currently in robotics research, where they'll simulate physically like a physical movement environment for robots in digital space, all the laws of physics, laws of material science, and they'll give them constraints, and they'll run a crap load of cycles of experimental stochastic movement until robots figure out like how to walk, and they do to your point, and then really well, and then exceptionally well, and then they do stuff in sim. Now robots are doing stuff in sim that no human could ever do because it's just like the most insanely coordinated thing you'll ever
Yeah,
see.
and most of it's based on the principles in CLA. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know.
But there is another way to train robotic systems and human systems, and that's a form of pre-training where you say, okay, combat sport is not, the end state is not stochastic. It's actually very easily definable. There
Right.
are a few dominant positions. There are a few submissions that
Well,
are insanely
when you say
effective.
stochastic, are we talking about robots again? Or are we talking about
Both.
people
Yeah, it's
learning
just
combat
like
sports?
non-random. Stochastic's
I know non-random. I know it's
fake
stochastic.
smart guy way of saying not random.
I
Yeah,
listen. I stochastic resonance is something I understand well, so I know what it means.
sure, sure. So basically, like grappling's not random. You're not trying to put humans into random positions interacting with each other.
Yes, yes, it is.
So like,
It's random.
but it's so the end state's not random.
What do you define that more?
Like I win if I take your back and sink in a choke. I have a higher win probability if I get there than if I get to your upper thigh and squeeze it, or if I get north south on you and you're on top.
There are
Would
certain
you?
conditions that lead to certain effects in our sport that we could consider winnable.
And they're asymmetric in the sense that they're based on the way the human body's designed. For
Correct.
example,
And we call this
your
physical
attack
certainty.
vectors are almost all front facing. They're not rear
Agree. Yep.
facing.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And so like taking someone's back, pathways to the back is a globally dominant position in the
Agreed.
average role.
Yep.
And so if we know that's a globally dominant position, we have a North Star, at least
Right.
one.
Correct.
We have a bunch more
Yep. Yep.
for sure. And then now that we have a globally dominant North Star position in this back take situation, we say, okay, over the course of grappling history, a lot of people tried methods of back taking, and we can derive three things from them. Some of those people are fucking stupid and wrong. Fine, me. Some of those people have gone onto some shit that seems to work better than average, better than a first guess would work, a lot better than a first guess. And then we can also find dependable principles of movement. Like, for example, if you want to take someone's back, you have to address the arms.
Right.
Like, if you're trying to take my
I'm
back, and
extremely well versed in grappling, and you're talking about using historical record to find physical certainty. I'm with you
I'm not talking
100%.
about certainty, just higher probabilities than
Physical
50-50.
certainty is things that are more probable than less.
You're you're saying the word certainty, but you're assigning a probability to it that's not 100. Can you explain to me how that?
Physical certainty is what you're saying. If I get behind someone, I'm more likely to finish them than if I'm front facing them.
Yeah, I don't think that's certainty. That's just like higher probability, right?
Okay, we can call it. physical higher probability, if you'd like.
Yeah. Oh, it's all guesses, right? You have better and worse guesses. And so if we know, we start to derive not only that the back is a supreme position, back take is good, and that certain pathways to the back seem to be out of massive grappler experience and kind of distilled down into some good fundamental principles. Probably not the entire problem space of principles. There's probably like 10 other ways no one's ever taken the back that some kid's going to do when he's 16 at ADCC Worlds. And you're like, oh my God, why didn't anyone else think of that? But at least we have some good ones. So now that we know that, it seems to me that in order to condense down the training process in terms of how much time it takes, we can pre-train humans who are new to grappling and not new to grappling and say, you know what? We want you guys to think very openly. And when you're in live rolling and your positionals, we don't want you to see yourself overly constrained by this way we're going to teach you. But we're both going to teach you that getting to someone's back is important. And we're going to teach you a few ways to get there that have a lot in common. And then as you explore this space in months and years of your training, you're going to be like, oh, okay, like now for my own body and for these positions and for 50 other differences that arise, I have a pretty cool arsenal and pretty good ability to kind of manage the adaptive space. Versus if we don't give them those initial kind of pre-training conditions, saying like, okay, there's no golden moves, there's not even, we're not even talking about moves.
I don't know. I'm confused as to why you're saying this, because you're doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. You have a massive misunderstanding of how CLA operates, and you're arguing against a straw man. We don't
Sure.
tell our
Please explain to me how it's a straw man.
we don't tell our students not to do things. We don't say go out there and fight. There's a method we use to create these things you're talking about. So
Okay, can
let's
you
say,
explain like how that would work?
yeah. What do you want to? What do you specifically want to know? Tell me what you want me to teach my student. I'll tell you how it would work.
What have I said so far in this backtake example? Would you say like that's definitely some of that's wrong and not the way we like to do things in the ecological approach?
None of it. We want to get behind people. So
Sure, sure.
all we need to understand is what constrains that as a possibility. So I need to create an environment in which my student can interact with their environment and create the conditions necessary that allow them to get behind their opponent.
Yeah, totally. For sure.
Yeah.
But they
So
also have to know like,
they don't have to
you know,
know
this is
anything.
the goal.
They have to know the goal. We have to know what we are trying to do, but they don't have to sit there and listen to a symposium on the physics that make it work. Well, we don't use
Oh,
that
for sure.
we don't
Yeah,
use that
no,
information.
for sure.
We don't use that information to move. So when I have to act out on the world, I don't look inside my mind and say, Josh told me that these three things are the best way to get there, so I'm going to use them. That's not what we use to move. We use
Okay.
the interaction with our environment and the things our opponent's doing and resisting us, and we use that as a way to measure where we are at any given time relative to where we're going. And we could say, markers or conditions that we need to set along the way that get us closer to achieving that end. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, getting under or behind elbows exposes a path to the back. So we
Mm-hmm.
know this because you can watch kinematics, you can watch people's biomechanics that take the back. That if we can get under or behind the middle joint, we gain access to the rear of our partner.
Mm-hmm.
So we put our students in situations where they get to experience that under live resistance, and the goal would be to, let's say, either stay under or behind the elbow, and or get behind your partner, reach this end state, win the game, do it again.
And they know that their goal is to take the back.
Correct. They have to. If we don't know
Uh,
what we're doing,
okay.
why
So when you
act?
tell them your goal is to take the back, you're asking them to create an understanding in their mind
No,
of three-dimensional space and simulate
no,
what taking the back actually means.
I'm
Otherwise, you just
not.
wouldn't understand what you're saying.
I'm
No?
giving them a condition that will lead them to an outcome, and they have to explore that task space to achieve that outcome. And it's through a constant interaction that develops and coordinates the skill of doing the thing.
Sure. Sure.
Well,
So
I use
my
something
my
like
thought here is like there's like almost infinite number of ways they could do that exploratory process as far as like vector sequences.
Not without getting under behind the elbow.
Uh if you get under or behind the elbow, there are like a trillion different ways you could do that.
Correct, but not
And
without those two conditions being met first.
oh, for sure. No, like that's great. Yeah. But then once my way into getting under and behind the elbow and navigating the space after that, my claim, and maybe this is kind of how I'm familiar with the motor learning research, is that giving people pretty well trotted roads from which to plan their more ecological
I,
salience off of
I don't know what you
is
mean.
good.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting. I don't know what you mean
That's
when you
okay.
say give them roads. What does that mean?
Yeah, you teach them to do a sequence of moves
How do you
that have
teach
been.
that? How are you suggesting I teach someone to do a sequence of moves?
Yeah. So you talk them through it as you demonstrate on someone who is sitting there.
So
Like,
you're saying that talking to someone and demonstrating is the thing they're going to use to organize their movement.
yeah, on rep number one, that's actually the only thing they're going to use, because that otherwise there's
So
just no
now,
reference for
because
what's going on.
I mean, I know for the last 10 years, I've been operating a gym that uses no explicit instruction and no static drilling at all. Not a single student in my gym. The hundreds of students that have been trained by me. None of my blues, purples, browns, or black belts. None of my world champions. None of my open champions. None of my ADCC trial. None of them use those methods. And they don't have the issues that you saying would exist if I didn't do the thing that traditionals say they do. There's a reason I took out explicit instruction and static drilling because it doesn't work. And so
Mhm.
I took it out and I did everything else. And I'm getting not only better results, but getting better results faster.
How do you think it works faster without taking all of these sort of well accumulated shortcuts that we've developed
They're
with
not
it?
shortcuts. They're tighter constraints. So when you tell somebody to do it this way and you say this is an optimized technique, you're creating a
So I
search.
wouldn't say that part. I wouldn't say it's an optimized technique.
Well, then what are you having them drill
I'd
for?
say it's a better guess than average, and I want you to start your space with this technique. Start your
It's
exploration with
definitely
it.
a better guess than nothing. Everything's better
Right.
than nothing.
Say that again.
I think it's definitely better than nothing. Anything done is better than nothing.
No, I
So
mean like
Watch more Instagram,
it,
Greg. There's some crazy shit out there.
what do you say? Well,
You
it's
got to look
better.
at
I mean,
Instagram. There's crazy
look,
shit out there.
the best thing in the world is to just spar and try to do things to your partner. This is why like guys like Joseph Chen and Ian O'Flanagan Owen O'Flanagan have made such success. These two guys have largely taught themselves, and they've done so through video watching. And mostly spar. I mean,
so
I'm Nicky
video
Rod, J
watching.
Rod.
Video watching, Greg, is tough because video watching, all you get is explicit instructions delivered to your eyes and your ears. How is it possible that Joseph Chen could have any effect on his movement pattern if by watching videos if he didn't experience the in the here and now?
So he doesn't get the skill from the video. So what happens is
What's he getting from the video?
an idea of where he might want to go.
Okay. How's that
So
different than a skill? That's the same
there
thing as a skill.
no, there's an evidence to suggest that when we watch expert performers do things, we pick up their affordances. So we pick up the same information sources that they're using to organize their movement. And then if we can take that as a point of inspiration or a point of focus or whatever you want to call it, and we can bring it into the live environment as a way to focus our intention and attention. There are many ways to get someone to focus on doing something, some being more effective than others, some being more effective than others relative to the type of learner we're dealing with. There are some people you can just say something to and that's enough. There are some people that you can just see it once and that's enough. But either way, if we're
There's no
talking,
people like that.
excuse me,
There's just no people like that.
people like what?
People who can be told once and then do the move perfectly in a
I,
complex dynamic environment. They
well,
don't exist.
perfectly is a misnomer.
Sorry,
Effectively is a
to a
better
high
word.
degree of competency, pro grappler and above. It's just
You
never
know,
happened.
well, because you can't go from trying something to pro grappler. There's a level of coordination, attunement, and adaptability
Sure,
that has
sure,
to go on. I'm
sure.
talking about just doing a thing. So, for example, if I watch, years ago, this is crazy. This kid named Euro, I remember, I'll never forget this kid. Came into my gym. He didn't know what grappling was. His friends were talking about it at school, so he looked it up online. And he found my school. He came in with his mom. And I asked him, I was, hey, little buddy, like, what's your deal? Why do you want to do this stuff? He's like, oh, my friends are talking about it look cool and I wanted to try it. He didn't even know what it was, right? The whole first week, we do nothing but live work or whatever. Next week, he comes in and we're doing some live rounds and he's triangling people. And I literally watched this happen with my own eyes. And I was like, dude, how do you know to do this? And he's like, oh, I was looking on YouTube and I found this guy, Gary Tonin. I like to watch his matches. So all he was doing was watching his matches. He never heard of a triangle. He never saw the technique of a triangle.
He
He
did.
was just obsessed
He
with
saw it
watching
in the
Gary Tonin.
video, Greg.
Correct. And
So he
so
did
he was
see it, right?
came back to the live environment and he was creating the opportunities for triangles just from watching. So No, because again, there's nothing not ecological about watching somebody do something and then gaining inspiration from that watching and then going to try it live. There's nothing wrong
But
with that at all.
but I thought you said that was not the greatest way to do things
It
because you
isn't.
can't learn from watching. You
I didn't
said
say you
that
can't learn
earlier.
from watching. You can absolutely learn from watching. It's one of the strongest ways to learn to do something.
You can't learn from
Showing,
being told.
showing is better than telling.
Sure, but it's a spectrum,
So,
isn't it? It's like telling might give you some good stuff, showing gives you a lot more good stuff, though sometimes there's a little confusing if you don't say a few things. And
right,
then the ultimate one is, of course, doing,
doing
but
correct.
doing right away is tough because no one showed you anything or told you anything, that kid, if he hadn't seen a whole lot of Gary
So
Tonin videos, he wouldn't be trying anyone. He would just be
correct. You're
pancaked.
right. But he just went straight for it. And some people are able to do that. Some people are not. But the thing is, whatever intervention we use to manipulate their intention and attention needs to be strong enough to get them going in a direction. Because feedback starts based on result. So I try to do something, I get a result, yay or nay, and then I adjust. So we need to get to that process right away. So when I have two beginners, it doesn't matter the techniques or the ways to do things. They need to experience something that looks like grappling that's going to build their ability to do things in the future. So if I'm working with beginners and I want them to start to learn how to manipulate elbows, guess what you think the first thing I have them do is? Manipulating elbows.
But
So
you're
we,
teaching them how to manipulate elbows?
when you guys say these words like teaching them, I don't know what you mean. When I hear teaching, I create an opportunity for the students to engage in such a way that they can see the result of their actions relative to what was asked of them.
So how would that look, for example? Like what would be
Like
going
I
on?
said, if I want to teach someone how to manipulate elbows, we would start with that. So a simple beginner game that we use from the mounted position, for example, would be top player starts on top of bottom player. Top player's job is to get both their arms underneath bottom player's elbows. If they get both their arms under bottom player's elbows and lock their hands, they win the game. Bottom player's job is to push at top player's hips and knees. If bottom player is able to push top player off and put them back in front of their legs, they win. So what we have done is taken a situation and we set up a constraint. The constraint is pushing arms versus getting under arms because they will counteract each other. And our students get an opportunity to engage in that problem with a focus of intention, i.e., get under elbows, i.e., push, and they get to start solving it. And it's in the solving of that problem that they start to both build the capacity to act and the skill to express that capacity, all in the same go. They have to make live decisions, they have to feel grappling, they have to engage. None of the bullshit I can tell them about grappling is going to help them.
Well, I think my contention is probably some of it will. Like if you tell people, look, if you just push with your arms, it's like not so effective. But if you hip while pushing and multiply the vectors against each other, you get a lot more benefit from that. It's kind of like a
Maybe,
universal principle, probably.
maybe, but it's not universal principle. These are just things we say.
Well, I think that it's universal in the sense that if you take anyone who's just trying to push someone away with their arms, if you teach them how to use hip drive sequenced with that, their probability of success escalates almost 100% of the time, 99 or
The
something.
body moves relative to the demands of the task. The only reason someone's going to use their hips to do anything is if the task demands it and they're able to pick up the information of its utility. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
What
You
if you
can
just teach
say,
it to them? Then it'll just
you
happen.
well, or so then they start pushing and bumping with their hips, and the guy on top locks their legs around their waist, and the bottom player has no idea why it's not working. He says, "Coach, I lifted my hips, I bumped, I pushed, but I couldn't get them off me. What do I do next?"
You say you're doing the right thing, but now we'll figure out how to fight the
No,
leg
they're not
entanglement.
doing the right thing. They're doing the
What, so
wrong
that
thing because it's
what's
not
wrong with the
effective.
pushing through the hips and the arms at the same
It's not
time?
working.
Well, arms by themselves would work even worse.
If my student pushes somebody off, I don't correct them because they push them off.
But aren't they learning bad habits to not dynamically sequence their movements?
No, because there's a dynamic sequence. It's an intellectualized cognitive process. It's a relationship between the demands of the task and my current capacity. It's a relationship. So nobody moves outside the demands of the task. And if they do, it's because you told them to do so, and they're only doing what you told them to do. They're not paying attention to what they're doing. They're paying attention to the thing inside their head that you told them to remember about what they should be doing. It's a different thing.
Yes. So I think maybe you could do both. Like you could give them the demands of the task and you can say, here's a little pre-training tip for how this can go better for you. Cause like you could have 30 minutes of practicing just with your arms. You could have 30 minutes of arms behind your back, hip bumping people. Robots do this in
Yeah,
simulation,
but
all
we're not
kinds of wacky.
robots, and we don't. That's come.
Like we are, there's like we're
We're not
mechanical
robots,
systems that
but we're
okay.
not.
No,
We're
we're not
adaptable,
literally
complex
robots.
systems. Robots are not.
Robots are going to be more complex than people in like 2 years. And
No, they'll
they,
never. Come on, man.
I mean that literally. Like GPT-4 is already smarter than most humans
It's
in the verbal
smarter.
space.
Smarter and complex don't mean the same thing. You're conflating.
Uh, I think they probably do. Okay. So backing up, we say, okay, there's 3 ways we can go about this, maybe 4. One way, we don't teach you shit. We just say, get out of this position, do whatever you want.
We don't do that.
Wait, say what?
We don't do that.
Super swell. Yeah, that would be ridiculous. 2 is I want you to push the guy off with your arms. 3 is I want you to just hip bump the guy. 4 is teaching just a mini version of a sequence where you hip bump and arm push. One follows the other, and that sequence transfers force as well from the ground into the opponent, creates the biggest distance so you can put in a knee or go to your next position. If we teach them that first move, the hip bump push simultaneously, which basically like some form of dynamic shrimping, and then we go give them the gameplay of now someone's on top of you, try your shit. Aren't they like kind of a step ahead and don't
No.
need to explore that latent space of ineffective relatively moves?
No, all this stuff you're see. This is the little bit of a frustrating point because all this stuff you're asking about has been worked. And when I say worked out, I don't mean solved to the end of time where it's 100% certain. What I'm saying is when they compare verbal interventions and decontextualized training interventions alongside contextualized versions of it, CLA, differential learning, CLA and differential learning outperform the other interventions by a huge statistical margin every single time. And even if there isn't a difference, because different task demands will make one intervention more effective than another, it has no effect at all. So verbal interventions and all the stuff you're talking about either has none or less of an effect than we want it to. And this is shown time and time and time again. There's a reason why CLA is like sweeping through the sports world. It's because it is a more effective way to engage in practice. The idea of coupling and not doing decontextualized training interventions is a massive one. It's superior in every sense. Like here's a small example, right? You guys know about the balance bike. Everyone's talking about this recently. You guys know what a balance bike is?
Mhm.
So typically when little kids learn a bike, they get a version of a decontextualized or decoupled bike. You got a bike with all its parts, but it's got these training wheels on it. So what the assumption is that when you learn how to pedal and steer, you'll learn how to balance. But traditional bikes, like training wheel bikes, only have a 75% transfer rate as far as going from the um, directly from the training wheels to actual riding a bike. Now there's this new type of bike called the balance bike, where rather than add training wheels, they just allow the kid to put their feet on the floor. So there's no pedals. So the propulsion mechanism is their feet. So they can move the bike, they can pick their feet up and start to balance and steer at the same time. And since they're not going to fall because they can put their feet down, the rate limiter of fear has been removed as it's been constrained away, and now kids can ride bikes at a faster rate. The balanced bike has a 100% transfer rate, 100%, where the traditional bike has 75%. That's a 25% difference just by understanding what constrains a learner. That's it. Just by understanding that we need to keep motion and balance coupled, and we need to reduce the rate limiter of fear. We get a 100% transfer rate by knowing that. That's a perfect example of CLA in action.
Mhm.
And that's what we're doing with our practices. We're doing the same thing as the balance bike. And the rate at which our students are learning is staggering. It's staggering.
Mhm.
There's no questions anymore. Like, I wouldn't go back if you paid me.
Sure. I mean, there's a very decent probability that you're completely correct about all this.
But it's not me.
But
It's the men who are smarter than me who discovered it. I'm just copying their work.
yeah, I mean, a lot of us are pretty smart. A lot of smart people get stuff wrong. A lot of folks that work in academia do incredible work. A lot of them do work that does not meet first contact with reality and everything in between. So it's probably good to like figure out like because there's a lot of fads in motor learning that come and go. Not all of them have been successful. A lot of them have proponents. So I think it's good to kind of figure this out to see if it kind of passes muster.
Well,
You know what I mean?
what other frameworks are you guys talking about? Because I only know really one or two other frameworks that people even use in this space.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I was taught like formal sports science at school, so we didn't really focus on frameworks.
You didn't learn Schmidt schema theory, because that's pretty much what most people are talking about when they talk about this stuff.
So we generally
Part practice, whole
eschewed
practice.
almost every part of motor learning that calls itself a theory because that's improper nomenclature. All the theories are actually hypotheses, and when they get a lot of evidence behind them, become models.
Yeah,
Theories
I
are
know the
things like
difference.
gravitation and evolution. So
Correct.
this is true in psychology too. Is we just don't talk about theories hardly ever until it's highly, highly dependable. So there are a lot of hypotheses with how motor learning works in the research literature, and some of them address kind of parts of the motor learning process, maybe not the entire thing. And so the methods that I'm most familiar with is start simple and then use the simple building blocks to build up. And that seems to deal with the fact that your cognitive bandwidth is a constrained entity. It's really difficult to make sense of really complex things at the same time.
For
And if you
sure.
start with simple things that build up
Right.
into building blocks for more complex things, then eventually you can sort of keep that same cognitive bandwidth. Once you understand the simpler stuff, you sequence it into more complex things, then eventually more complex things. That doesn't mean like you just drill for a year and then you do positionals for a year and then you live roll for a year. There's a place for all of those at all the same time. But it does mean potentially that there are distinct benefits in drilling that are not as efficiently gained through live work. For example,
Like what?
like making sure that you get the movement pattern that we think is a higher probability of success than not.
Give me
A
an
well
example of what that means. Give me an example of a movement pattern that can be learned without resistance, that can be optimized without resistance being present.
learned without resistance,
Yeah.
almost every single one. Optimized without resistance, zero. But the initial learning and optimization phases can be separated and then sequentially reintroduced on occasion.
Okay. Okay. No, you're making that claim based on what evidence?
Like you like specifically referenced empirical studies.
Well, no, no, no. You're saying that a thing can be can a skill can be decontextualized, and then put and transfers over and can be put directly back into context.
Yeah.
Like,
So, yeah, like, so just as an example, you
yeah.
teach wrestlers how to do an ankle pick. They drill the living shit out of an ankle pick. They learn how to pull off an ankle pick in situations where you get more effective reps. Because if someone really good is blocking your ankle pick attempt, if they're going truly
But
live,
how do you know
you're
they're
just not going to
blocking
get
your
it.
attempt when all you've ever done was statically drill an ankle pick? How do you know what blocking means?
Well, you might not know anything, but they do, and they just don't let you get any reps. Like you go live, I move my feet back, you don't get any ankle
So
picks.
how do you ever get the first rep then?
Because the person has to purposefully reduce their intensity of resistance, which could mean movement speed. They move their leg back, but they do it slow and on a delay, so you're fast enough to catch it before it
But,
goes.
but what
And then over
happens when
time, they'd
people
speed it up for you.
and how do we transfer that slow to fast? How does that happen in the body?
Yeah,
So
so
how
like
do
as
we
soon as you're
know
good, yeah, yeah.
how do you know
So
you're good enough to go against a faster person?
Yeah, so it's a kind of incremental process. Your body essentially codes into its neural network a prearranged sequence of steps that it becomes incrementally more comfortable with doing. And then once it's really comfortable with doing them slower, you see a certain success rate. Like someone could demo 10 knee cut passes, and all 10, the black belts are like, that's a good knee cut pass. I mean, there's a couple things going on there, but it's pretty good. And then if we crank up like Josh and I do in training, and this is kind of a Josh Vogel thing, as you crank up the intensity of resistance against the knee cut pass, you incrementally get to more problems and
How do you
lower probability of
how do you
success.
increase intensity, and how do you know that you've done it?
You just try harder pushing with your muscles.
How just with sheer cognition. Like today I'm going to
Yeah.
try real hard.
Yeah, yeah. We like 50%, 25%, 75%. These are
How,
meaningful
how do you
things.
control those percentages cognitively? What mechanism in the body controls those percentages?
If you're a black belt, do you know where your whole range is? Because you have a crazy dynamic
No, no, we're
range
talking
and
about
you're,
white belts. We're talking people who are learning. How does the learner know the difference between
oh, yeah.
25 and 77?
Oh, yeah. White belts don't know super well,
But how do they
but
ever get to learn it if they don't know?
they can be taught like, hey, I want you to try very, very light and mostly let them get the move, but on occasion push back a little bit, but no grunting, no crazy shit. And they sort of intuitively pick up like, oh, it's like a more of a cooperative thing. It's not perfect, but like you can definitely get white belts to try less hard versus super hard against each other. There's like, that can be done. And so basically once someone has demonstrated that they know the move in isolation, where all of their cognitive headspace is designed just to groove that move in, you can take that and start cranking up the resistance against it, seeing what kind of problems come out. The good thing about cranking resistance is it introduces you all the problems, all the assumptions that were wrong, and all the incorrect movement patterns. The bad thing about it is if you crank it high enough, it actually prevents learning from going on almost altogether, because they just don't have enough successful repetitions at the thing we want them to do well at. And like in neural learning, repetition is king. Like that's just like how neural networks work. Training data is always valuable, and the more reps you get at something, the better you get at it. So once you have a decent, let's say, ankle pick, and then we don't give you, maybe for 20 minutes you learn how to do it, we don't give you a lot of resistance. Maybe later in that session we give you some resistance, you encounter some problems, we offer you solutions to say, yeah, hey, okay, so I'm moving my leg back, you're kind of reaching like this, we want you to really reach, open up your shoulder and reach. You give them that correction, they go, okay, they try it, it works, they go, ooh, they practice it, because like to your point, them, you just telling them do this and it works, like one rep's not going to fix the problem. They need a few more reps at it, maybe a few dozen reps, to be like, okay, now my body more naturally reacts in this way. And then in live training, at first you do easier live where you get them lots of success, and you start cranking up the resistance and the problems until they encounter very little success. You scale back, scale forward, scale back, scale forward, and then they get to refine what it is an ankle pick means to them. That entire time, they're not live 100%, they're not drilling with zero resistance, but they're dynamically working through that whole range. And once you lean into the part of drilling, which means you really lets you practice the move really well, versus the dynamic range. It's like, here's a rap battle, and here's teaching a 4-year-old how to say mama. Like, you got to calm the fuck down and say mama, or otherwise, if you just do rap battle flow all the time, they're going to take like years and years and years to be able to flow with the top guys. Whereas if you build up an architecture of words and how to say them and let them intuit from their inference model how to put them into language, at some point, they're just going to scale up much better. And so we're kind of using the benefits of the simpler techniques in isolation and then linking them through positionals and combinations to the more complex executions. Understand that if we tried to do only live, we learn not much, because almost no one's successful. First of all, don't really know what to do. And second of all, even if they tried it, full resistance live means almost no success, which means almost no training, which means the neural network just doesn't have an experience of like, how do you do a double leg? They're like, well, I've tried it a bunch. It never really works. I have no idea if I'm doing it right. I never have the ability to follow through. So that's not the right answer. And adjust technique, to your point, is absolutely not the right answer, because like, holy shit, you can think you can do a single leg or an ankle pick, but someone's going to put their hips down on you and you're like, fuck, I don't know shit. So it's about learning the simple stuff and then weaving it through and increasing layers of complexity, and then back again to refine, and then forward. That iterative process move forward lets people get to like Cale Sanderson level of single ankle picking the entire earth. Like no one can do anything about it. Is there anything about that process which is like suffers from some problems?
All of it. Everything you said for the last 3 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, I don't even know where to start. I mean, the amount of assumptions that you make in that monologue was insane. Like, I don't even know. I wouldn't even know where to begin to like combat any of it. I mean, assumptions about
Well,
what's
just
happening
explain it simply,
cognitively.
I don't know things.
No,
Like it
we
should
all
be
don't know
easy.
a lot, man. But like I don't even. God, I wish I had Josh Peacock on here with me. He could handle this. Um, the whole thing is what we're really all talking about when we're creating programs is scaling. We need people to be able to do something else. If we just have people go live, there's going to be too much complexity for the new learner to engage in a meaningful way.
Mm.
So static drilling and everything you just talked about, like doing ankle pick this way and reps, blah blah blah, those are just people trying to scale practice, and it's all suboptimal. It's best guesses.
What
It's
do you mean by
based on nothing.
scale?
So from something that is easier to access and something that's more difficult to access, simple to complex, easy to hard, the scale of things. Weightlifting is a scale. You want to work at a certain percentage to get a certain effect on your muscles. You have to know what scale you're operating in, and then you have to adjust the scale relative to the effects you want from the weightlifting. It's the same thing with skill acquisition. So I need to act out on the world. I need to act in such a way that I can gain some feedback by the results I either achieve or don't. And then I need to play around in that zone until I develop a pattern of movement that I can use to solve the problem that I'm facing. So when new learners are, let's say, practicing pins, they don't need to know anything about options or mount, side control. They literally just need to practice holding somebody down. That's the first thing a person has to do. Nothing else. We can give them simple tasks. Top player, hold bottom player down, bottom player, push top player off. And then we can manipulate that in different ways to get different outcomes. It's that simple. And we scale it. We can scale it with time, like shorter time, more intense, longer time, less intense. We can scale it with partner selection.
Why would the time determine intensity, Greg? I don't understand that
If
exactly.
I have to grab your leg in 30 seconds and put you on your butt, or I have to grab your leg, I have 10 minutes to grab your leg and put you on your butt, the speed at which I have to move and the intensity at which I have to move to accomplish that end is going to be affected by the time.
You're assuming people make the cognitive processing step of thinking
I'm
there's an
not making the
impetus to do
cognitive.
this as
No, there's no
quickly as
cognition.
possible.
You have 30 seconds to put that dude in his ass. Go. Are you going to stand there?
I'm going to try to do my best, but
But you're going to have to work really
experienced
hard because you
grapplers
don't.
typically do very similar things no matter the time constraint.
If
Like they
I
work on
said
their
you
own
had to
pace.
run from point A to point B in 30 seconds, or you had to get there in 10 minutes, would that change the way you get from point A to point B?
Assuming I was asked to run maximally
I'm not
rapidly,
asking you anything. You have 30 seconds to cover that distance, or you have 10 minutes.
I would jog.
But you have 5 seconds to go from here to there. What would you do?
Begin to take my first steps of a jog.
You
I've
have
seen Mike jog.
say what?
I've seen Mike jog in class.
All right.
It takes a while.
Again, if you have a distance to cover and you have two different time scales, one is 5 seconds, one is 10 minutes, your speed will be different. It has to be.
It doesn't have to be. You're assuming I'm trying to get there as quick as I can, right?
If you only have 5 seconds or you fail, you have to.
Oh, there's a failure condition.
We're playing a game. What are you joking?
Well, I thought games were like fun exploratory things in which you tried to see how your body moves in space.
What? We're playing a grappling game. I have to do things to you to try to win the game. If I have 30 seconds to do something to you to win the game and I have 10 minutes, it's going to change the speed at which we engage.
Maybe. But what if we just try to go at our best and then get really tired?
I'm confused. If I just play this game, I need to
Yeah,
put you on your butt. I have 30 seconds to do it, or I lose.
yeah.
Or I have 10 minutes to put you on your butt. I need to do it within that 10 minutes, or I lose.
Just once in both cases.
Once in both cases.
Okay.
Which is calling for a greater level of intensity?
Through inference, the 10-minute one, but it
There,
requires inference. Like it just does, Greg. I'm not trying to be obfuscatory. Check
you
this
are.
out. I know I am, but I'm
If
not
I have
trying
to
to be.
put you on your butt and I only have 30 seconds to do it, you could absolutely just stand there and do nothing. You
I
could.
love fuscatory. That's like the best word.
And you would lose the game. But if you wanted to win
Sure.
that game and you had 30 seconds to accomplish your task, the demands would require you, the time demands alone would require you to move harder. To what degree? I do not know. Everyone's heart is different. But 30
Sure.
seconds, you would have to move harder than you would in 10 minutes. If I had
Sure.
10 minutes to put you down, I could be more strategical. I could be more tactical. I could wear you out with pressure over time. I could do
Yeah.
all kinds of shit.
You could also do second order game theory and just rush in rapidly because they wouldn't be anticipating it.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking
But
pure
that's what's
intensity
going on. It's
alone.
live. All game theory goes.
No, but what I'm telling you is this. If I set up a condition by which you have to accomplish something in a lower time versus a higher time, that alone constrains intensity if you intend to win. Now, we have to make the assumption of intention because we're assuming that the player is playing to win.
Why would you assume that? Like, I mean, a lot of grappling isn't like you don't try to win in practice all the time. You're not trying to win in drilling
You're,
all the
you're,
time.
you're, it, I'm trying to show you something.
Yeah. I'm trying to see it.
If we train to have an effect on our ability to do something in the future, i.e., get better at this task,
Hmm.
we are engaging with that in mind, correct?
Yeah, in the long view, totally. Hmm.
Great.
But
So
not all short views are the long view.
if I set up a training session where we're using a task goal, like put somebody on the ground to help them develop that skill, and I design those task demands for 30 seconds to be done in, and you are using that time to accomplish that task because that doing that task is going to make you better. These are assumptions we're making about training. Then you must operate on that time scale. That is a more intense time scale to accomplish your task than it is over a longer time scale.
And you think that method is superior to telling people to get a fraction of their oomph going when they're trying?
100%.
How do you know that? Just a hypothesis that's worked in
I
your
don't know why you
gym?
say, how
Or
do I know that? It's very confusing for me. If you only have a small window to do something, you must move harder and faster to do it, assuming all things are equal. And we're
you're
just,
assuming a lot, man. You got me earlier for assuming a ton.
no,
You're
no,
assuming a
listen,
ton.
listen to what I'm telling you.
Mhm.
There is what's called a safe assumption or an unsafe assumption or
That-
unreasonable
I,
assumption.
I think
Right.
that's a false dichotomy. There are probabilities escalating and de-escalating of strength of assumption. It's a spectrum because it is.
We are training for the purpose of getting better. We can assume this, correct?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Would we choose a training intervention and we want something to be intense or less intense? If I have to do the thing that I'm intending to do at a shorter time versus a longer time, I have to do it within this time scale. I would have to be more intense to get it done. I would have to move harder and faster because the time is demanding it. This does not mean I can't do the same thing in 10 minutes, but in 30 seconds, I would have to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I think it's an effective way to help folks modulate their intensity.
it is
But
more effective than saying something
how do you know
because
that?
because we do not have a mechanism for controlling intensity based on someone telling us. Like,
We do all the time, man. Like when people say a jog that way, very few people full sprint. They told them something. It had nothing about time. I go to basketball practice right now. Get the fellas together. All right, guys, slow jog to that line and back. Very few people misunderstand what I say.
but
There's
you're just
definitely
saying
a
slow
mechanism.
jog. But listen, like right now,
Yeah,
you're an expert lifter, okay?
yeah.
If
I
I
like that.
told
Thank
you
you.
to, come on, man, you're fucking 260 pounds and
Yeah,
just get out of here. Like if I told you to flex your bicep at 30% effort, you would not be able to do it more successfully than me.
yeah, sure shit would. There's direct data on this. Experts know how to scale their strength better than beginners.
All right. I I don't know if you can do this because you probably have access to equipment and people and whatever. We wouldn't even have this discussion. I don't know how you measure like total squeeze versus partial squeeze. I'm sure there's some type of thing you could put on your arm and you
Yeah,
could
there's
actually
tons.
you could flex real fucking hard and get a readout.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Get the total readout. And then, if I say, okay, like 30%, and then if your squeeze would be 30% of that, I guarantee you can't do it.
Stronger people, I think this is like an assumed thing that has lots of evidence for it. I could be wrong about this. Something I learned at school was that stronger, more well trained lifters are able to scale their strength per requisite demand better than untrained lifters.
Right. But my point is that if we're not comparing trained versus untrained. What I'm saying is the mechanism is the same for both of us. It would be a best guess. Now, you are very sensitive to muscular tension because that's what you practice. So you're going to be better at sensing levels of muscular tension than I am per se. But the mechanism we would use to try to determine that would be about the same.
But
So
you
our
said you
stand,
wouldn't be any worse than me, but you're saying I would be better, but the
I'm,
mechanism's
I'm
the
let
same.
me
It's a
make my
different
point.
thing.
The standard deviations between us would probably be the same.
What do you mean the standard deviations between us?
Like if we did a bunch of different trials trying to get to 30%, our adjustments would probably be about the same.
So, like, from the evidence that I'm familiar with, folks that are stronger and more experienced at lifting can grade force better because they just have more
I'm not
experience grading
disagreeing with you.
force.
I'm not disagreeing
Yeah.
with you. What I'm telling you, the mechanism that we would use to guess with that is going to be about the same. We don't have a strong mechanism for it. Now, yours through training is stronger than mine. So,
Yeah.
eh, right. But the mechanism we would use to try to determine that would be about the same.
Which mechanism is
But wait,
that?
wait. But wait. If I could take your one rep max of like a bicep curl and
Mhm.
I could put 30% on a bar, and that would get exactly 30% or roughly something like it. But asking you to do it
Assuming people are trying their hardest. That's the big assumption here.
again, there are certain ones we have to make. Because we're like we have
For
to start
sure.
with an axiom one way or another, depending on what we're discussing, and we have to, So if we're talking about trying to accomplish a task, we can assume intentionality. If intentionality is not there, that's a problem in and of itself.
Sure.
So no training intervention will solve that problem.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. All I'm saying is telling folks to go harder or go easier, various ways to say that, percents or whatever, and using time constraints are two different effective ways to organize a task and
Yeah.
make sure it's done well. And like they maybe both have their upsides and downsides and both have some decent marginal effect. I'm not saying that the telling people 10 minutes versus 30 seconds has no effect on their performance in the two tasks. Of course, it will have an effect, but there's going to be some confusion that the intensity, just telling them 25% resolves. Concomitantly, just tell them 25% introduces another level of confusion that the time thing could resolve. So maybe combining them would be really cool if you were like, hey, give me 90% ish or above with 30 seconds. And then you go to 10 minutes, you go, hey, fellas, nice and easy. Remember, it's 10 minutes, there's plenty of time. Don't go crazy hard. Wouldn't that be better than just saying one or the other, do you think? Or do you think just
No,
one of just
the thing is we're trying to make the most effective practices that we can. We're in love with these colloquialisms, and most of the reason I think we are is because coaches like to fucking talk. Okay, we want to be these gurus who just yap at our students, but we have better mechanisms for trying to get what we want to get. So if we want true intensity, we're doing it for a reason. It's not just, oh, go light, go hard. It's I am trying to increase my performance value over here in the performance setting. I need to be able to enact this skill in a short time scale, which requires intensity. So we train it in a coupled manner. Can I accomplish this task in a low time scale? That's actual skill. Telling someone just go light or easy, that has nothing to do with anything. And even if we do, though it may affect their movement, it doesn't really get at what we're trying to use it for. Like, why would I want someone to go light or easy without time being a factor, for example, or without?
because it allows their partner more reps, as an example. Like if someone's like drilling with me and I just don't get the memo and I fully resist, they get 0 good reps, and that's kind of not great of a session. But
Assuming
if
that reps are the thing we need to increase our skill,
well,
and
that's not, is that controvertible to you?
assuming that we know what a rep is.
Well, a rep is an executed technique from start to finish. Like I ankle pick you, I push your hip down, you fall on the ground, ankle pick successful.
But it's
That's
not
a
just
full
the
rep.
ankle pick. It's the stuff that's happening before the ankle pick and after the ankle pick and during the ankle pick. It's
I
the
think it's
stuff that's
just the ankle
happening.
pick, really. That's the
But
reps of
you
ankle
can't
pick.
use just the technique as the metric because the technique isn't just what's happening. If you watch a wrestling match, you don't just see techniques. If you watch a jiu-jitsu match, you just don't see techniques. There's grappling going on. There's
No, for
push
sure.
pull. And so, how do you train all the other shit that's going on just by training ankle picks?
You don't. But ankle
Correct,
picks
you
have a
don't.
place because if you always train all the other shit, it might take you somewhere between way too long and never to arrive at really
Why do
good
you guys
ankle
say
picking
this?
time.
I have an entire school. And
Hey, Greg,
not
like,
only do I have an entire
listen,
school of people operating like this,
all
but
all due respect, all due
yeah,
respect, Greg. The N of 1, N of 12, N of 50 guys that you have is like it's valuable because clearly some shit you're doing is fucking working. What I'm here to say is that maybe a synthesis of your approach with the traditional approach
there is
could
no
yield even better
synthesis.
outcomes in some
There
situations.
is no
No doubt you have
synthesis.
your killers, but like, bro, to be honest, and this is real talk, like all love and respect, man, all love and respect. There's fucking dudes at gyms in fucking Brazil that don't think about fucking shit. They just go at it. No fucking organization, no reading neuroscience, and they're fucking gods. They just shit on
I
everyone just
agree.
because they're that fucking Brazilian. That's not a
Yeah,
dependable
dude.
way to. But if you try to train
Yeah,
like them, mostly you just get hurt and not as
yeah,
good
for
because
sure.
yeah.
No,
So
you
like
don't
that,
want
you have a room full of killer shit as baller, and it shows
to,
a
dude.
point, but it doesn't like it doesn't prove the entire world model to be true. You know what I
wh-
mean?
so it does a couple things. So one, you're absolutely right. If I could get a bunch of robust dudes to be in a room and kill each other, and it was dog eat dog, we would get some of the toughest dudes on planet Earth out of that room. But
Yeah,
again,
and
it's
Gordon
not
Ryan
scale.
would still beat all of them.
It's not who.
Gordon Ryan would still beat all of them because he practices a very
Gordon
instrumentally technical,
Ryan
fine-tuned
is a
approach.
great jiu-jitsu player. We all love Gordon Ryan.
It was the best of
Gordon
all time,
Ryan
right?
is enhanced to the gills.
So am I. I can't beat
I
anyone at B team, and those are my
right.
boys, and he beat
And
every single one of those
and
guys. What's the
you wouldn't be as big as you were without it. So the thing is it's not that it's wrong, it's that it matters. And the thing is capacity has a huge effect on how much skill can be expressed. And And Gordon Ryan is operating with a lot of wonderful constraints. He's got a great coach who knows what the fuck is going on in the grappling world. He's got a lot of great, big, strong bodies that come to train with him, and he's got a lot of capacity. He's tall, he's strong, he's smart, he's
Mhm.
driven, he's egotistical. These all are what constrain to be as good as he is. So it's not the drilling; it's everything else about Gordon Ryan that
How do you
makes him
know it's
good.
not the drilling? Because there's lots of studs looking like Gordon running around. I've
No,
seen
there's
a ton
not.
of them.
Look, he is sitting in a special time and place. He's constrained by the circumstances of his life and who he is. That's how greats emerge. Look, I can't say this, and of course this is just anecdotal, but you could take all the drilling away and he would still be as good as he was. It
But I
wouldn't
think
make any.
the reason that him and a few other guys, their connection with John Danaher works so well is John Danaher has discovered a series of exploits, a series of game theoretic optimal paths that other people just hadn't considered. Paths to the legs, paths to the back, sequences for arm bars. And he's distilled that knowledge down into roughly, hey, try it like this. And when people try it and ingrain it into their movement patterns, they realize that a lot of people just don't see the stuff coming, or the way they've been doing other stuff isn't as great. And then thus they get a huge salient advantage because they're doing stuff way outside of anyone's preparatory abilities to anticipate it. And they've really hyper optimized, probably with a decent amount of technical exploration for very fine tuned manipulations. I might just have the Danaher method completely misunderstood. Maybe they should go in there and explore, but I feel like John Danaher's in there kind of showing them some stuff.
He is
And
there
you're
showing
here
him some
saying,
stuff.
Greg, like showing stuff is not the way to do it. You got to get the guys into proper constraints and fucking go. But he's racking up all these fucking studs, and so are you. So I think maybe
No,
a combination works best, or what do you think?
so there is no combination, man. There again, like I said, there's a lot of reasons why he is Danner's who he is. The guys are who they are. They're operating with a massive talent pool. Many people are going into that room. There's lots of reasons. He's a good coach, but he's a good coach despite him showing moves. He's a good coach despite the static drilling. You could take those two things away and you'd still get what he's creating. So it's not necessary. That's the point, right? So it doesn't do what we think it does. I don't know why people can't wrap their heads around it. Doing static movement over and over and over again, and this is not just in jiu-jitsu, this is across behavior science, across sports, is shown to be either ineffective or have no effect at all.
Okay,
This,
I got a quick example for how that a different situation. It's a little bit out of scope,
yeah,
but might make some sense. So I'm not involved a ton in shooting, like pistol
I
shooting
know
and rifle
anything about
shooting.
shooting.
Sure. But seemingly almost the consensus at this point in what's called like the tactical space, running and gunning, shooting terrorists and
Yeah,
compounds,
yep, yep.
is the number one thing that's important is how robustly you draw up your weapon, get a sight picture, and pull the trigger. And that's something actually you can train in a static range, never moving. And guys that have spent years training in a static range, you can work them up for a few weeks and they're killers on the fucking tactical sims. Whereas guys that do the fucking slide and the rotation and really learn how to move at speed, but don't spend enough time putting sight picture on and shooting at it, they don't get the same thing out of a very immersive ecological approach, because what they've discovered with shooting was the basic fundamental distillation is you're almost always going to be pointed on how quickly you draw up, sight picture, pull the trigger, and the
Okay.
ecology kind of is a very secondary order sort of thing.
What
It's
do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? The ecology is a secondary order
like the
kind of thing.
terrorists could be upstairs, they could be downstairs, they could be running at you, they could be going away. That's important stuff. But your ability to do that basic fundamental 101 style technique of drawing up, sight picture, pulling the trigger is like 90% or 80% of the entire thing. So if I
Okay, then
take
if
Jordan
that
Burroughs,
if
for
that is the
example,
case, wait, if that is the case,
mhm,
then their training interventions are going to have to reflect that. And if that's enough, then that's enough. I don't know anything about that. So what you're saying is that if 90% of the conditions that a shooter that's going to contribute to shooter accuracy in novel situations is their ability to draw and get their gun on target,
mhm.
then what if that is it? Then all their training is going to revolve around that. So I
Sure,
don't know
but
any.
that's like a
That's
basic
not the.
technique.
That is the ecological approach.
It's
Like
not, because the ecology is shit blowing up and terrorists all over the
no,
place.
no, no,
That's
no,
the
no, no, no,
real
no.
ecology.
Those are just so if those things have no effect on that 90% and those novelties, can be basic, they have no perturbation on the skill, then it doesn't matter. That's the whole thing. That there is noise in the system that doesn't affect the signal. So if that's the case, then their training interventions are perfect. They're great, and we
Sure.
wouldn't want to change them.
Sure. So let me give you another example. Jordan Burroughs and his double leg. Like, you can have all sorts of ideas about how you're going to defend it. You can say Jordan hasn't been around different positions in a double leg, but he got his double leg through drilling, and then after he was pretty good at drilling it, he
Saying
instantly
that
started
you're
just like
assuming
blowing people out
it.
of the
You're
water.
just saying that.
I'm not.
You
That's
are
how
just saying
wrestling
that.
training
You are
works
literally
in
just saying
almost the
Jordan
entire
Burroughs.
United States.
You're saying Jordan Burroughs good at double leg by drilling a double leg. That is just a statement you're making.
Do you think he organically arrived at a double leg with no
I
drilling?
don't know. God, what are you guys saying? You guys are driving me insane. What do you when you say or, organically come in a double leg? What are you saying?
That somehow, through the process of exploration and live training, that he
Which is what his
discovered
whole life has been centered around.
it. So, Greg, you wrestled before?
No, not
Wrestlers
like.
drill like crazy,
It doesn't matter that they drill.
but they also say things like drillers make killers.
It doesn't matter that they say that.
Sure,
People
sure.
say all the time. 50 million people can believe a stupid thing, and it's still a stupid thing.
For sure. One person can believe a stupid thing and it's still a stupid thing.
A stupid thing's a stupid thing.
Yeah. Agree. They could all be wrong. But it seems to me that when wrestlers drill a move more and that move becomes ultra fluid for them
But
with
you're
no
assuming that
resistance.
that's what makes it fluid, man. You're assuming that.
I mean, it literally does. Maybe there's better ways to make it fluid, but drilling absolutely makes you better at the move. It doesn't make you better as good at the move as you would like to be in a live context. That's for sure
Live
true.
context is all that matters. So all we need to do is we need to get a student from not being able to do something to doing something, and we need to put them in the environment in which they need to do something. That's all that's required. The problem is we haven't had a good method for doing that until as of recent. Like, constraint manipulation has been going on since the beginning of time. We only have constraints to manipulate. That's the big idea. But now we're much more aware of the effect they have. So we can remove a lot of the training interventions that are what we call decontextualized training interventions. We don't need them. We don't need to perform actions outside of the context. There's been a million studies done where the fundamentals are learned whether kids just play around with, like, say, a ball, or they are shown how to do it. In both cases, there's no difference between the fundamentals emerging. They emerge at the same rate at the same time in the same way. So explanations, decontextualized drilling has no effect on fundamentals or abilities. That is almost none.
So if you let kids just play around with the ball,
Yeah.
you're going to get them as good as if a soccer coach came in and taught them how to run and kick and
Yep.
block properly.
Yes, and that's happening right now all over the world. We're just late to the party.
Okay. Where is that happening exactly? Like,
In football all across the world, it's happening at almost every level. I talk to so many different football coaches at UCLA, and they talk about it. Like, the same arguments you guys are giving me are the same arguments they have to face. It's crazy. And no matter how much they showed that the fundamentals aren't a thing in the way we think they are, nobody reads the studies and no one pays attention to them.
yeah. Well, I think people read the studies.
They don't.
Sometimes the studies are suffer from various limitations.
For sure, as every study does. But what
Yeah.
suffers more a limitation? The anecdotes of Greg Souders or the fucking study that 30 scientists tried to put together? You know what I'm saying?
I think it's about equal.
Come on. My single
Usually it's
life
not 30 scientists, and usually they're completely detached from any giving a shit about even the passion of the sport beneath. I've done lots of, I'm a scientist. It's not a pretty picture what goes on underneath all the
Look,
time.
academia has its own problems, but what I'm saying is this.
Yeah.
If they control for these things you guys are saying, and the results that you say are happening aren't happening, we have to go where the evidence goes. We have to.
Yeah. There are many different kinds of evidence. And I think at the base layer, we know that there are certain actions in jujitsu that, for various good reasons, or just discovered from multiply just doing jujitsu for a long time, are better ideas about how to move than not.
But none of that has to do with the ecological approach or CLA.
But if you pre-train those by doing
What is pre-training?
Pre-train means you let them do that specific action in isolation,
And then the action isolation does not transfer to action in context.
It does. It's called transfer of training. There's a rich literature
Transfer
about how
training
it does.
doesn't go from static to live. It doesn't happen that way.
It absolutely does, Greg.
It only goes from live to live.
That's That's not the case, man.
Yeah, it is
I
the
don't know
case
what to say.
because you know what's funny? You can drill a thing a million times, but guess what you have to do once? You have to do it once with resistance. It only starts when you do it with resistance.
It doesn't. You can scale almost anything. So, for example, if I let you get under a squat bar that's heavy, you're not learning a shitload. You're probably just getting hurt. And
Yeah, but I
you're
have to
actually going
squat.
to learn a lot of shit wrong.
But I have to
Maybe
squat.
say what?
I have to squat.
Yes, but you'll squat with no resistance first.
There's no such thing. Gravity pulls me down.
You can even detangle gravity by grabbing a Smith machine bar fixed and just moving your hips until we get it right. And then we let you do it
There
with
is no getting it right because you squat relative to the demands of the task. So the way you
no,
squat when you
squatting is
hold
prescriptive. We know exactly how you should be squatting to 95%.
it is
And then the
much
rest of the 5% is how you figure it out ecologically for
squatting is
you.
not a complex continuous action. So you're actually right. It's much more discrete or even close to serial. So
Neither is a
we
double leg.
the double leg is complex continuous. It's not a discrete skill because it's nested in a bunch of other skills. It's
Nested
not a
skills
thing by itself.
can still be discrete even though they're nested.
It
So
isn't.
like
You can't. It just nested by its nature makes it non-discrete.
no, it doesn't. It's just something you know. And when you find yourself in a position to do it, you pull off the thing
No.
that you know.
Discrete is a is a quality. It's not a known thing. Discrete is a thing. Discrete is beginning end. This is a thing.
Yeah, like the beginning and end of a ankle pick looks really similar no matter the context. It doesn't look identical, and you have to address that later in positional training and
When does
live
the
training.
ankle pick start?
Say what?
When does the ankle pick start?
When does the ankle pick start?
Yeah,
Like
you
it's
said it's discrete. So when does it start?
it starts when you tilt your hips down to move forward to grab the ankle.
Does it?
Yeah, you're going to say that it starts with me addressing the hands first or being close. But
Which
that
is
is a
that's the
position,
truth,
addressing the hands and being close is a universal position for addressing almost every move. And that's
right?
something
And
that
so
you can
that's
be
why
taught in its
that
own way
that's why that
and in
must be
dynamic
trained.
training. But that
No,
doesn't mean that going for in a completely isolated environment, going for the ankle pick is a bad idea because it gives your body practice at the movement, and then your body has a decent plan. And your
but body
brain
don't.
weaves that
You're
plan
again. You're saying bodies have plans. I don't know how you can say those words. When you
like
say
a primary motor cortex. There's like a
there,
homunculus and everything.
there's not a homunculus. There is
There's
no
literally
central.
a homunculus in the primary motor cortex.
There is no central controller. We don't. Our actions are controlled centrally.
But what do you mean? How do you know how to
So
do things? How come I'm not as good at tennis as fucking the best tennis guys? 'Cause I don't
because
have their data in my head.
you haven't trained tennis. It's not what's in your
Yeah,
head.
but training is a neural network process. It's the
Correct,
neurons
but
changing.
that neural network is developed through interaction.
It can
So
be developed in multiple ways, and we're
it
just talking
has
about
to be
different
developed
kinds
through
of
interaction.
interactions.
It
It can be developed with action and then interaction. First action, then interaction. It
there
doesn't just
is
have to
so
be interaction all the time.
yes there does. It has to be. This is like I don't even know how to tell you this because you can go look it up yourself.
I have a PhD in this stuff, man. I
You have you
disagree with you.
yeah, but you're not giving me any evidence to suggest that a decontextualized
I mean,
thing
like
becomes a
almost everyone in the
contextualized thing.
world trains like this and has produced the best champions ever. There's like some
That
decent amount of evidence.
no, it
There's
isn't.
a bunch of different studies that examine cognitive load, and if you just try to oversaturate, people learn very little. But if you break the tasks down into simpler components and then fuse later, you get better learning than if you just try to use the whole
Yeah,
task at the same time at any
for
given of
sure. No,
complexity.
absolutely. Because
So that's
in
evidence.
no, it's evident for what happens when we deal with complex information. If the complex information is too much for us to handle at any given moment, no learning occurs. So scaling is an absolute necessary thing for all training interventions. I'm not arguing the necessity of scaling. I'm simply saying that you can't develop skill in a decontextualized manner. I'm not saying anything else other than that. Everything you've gave me an example of is decontextualized interaction. And I'm saying that there is not a single study in the world that suggests that that occurs. None.
There's tons, man. Like when you teach people how to play tennis, you teach them the forehand, you teach them the
No,
backhand.
that's traditionalism. That doesn't. You don't have to do that anymore. That was an old assumption about how training works. Even the people, even the proponents of those studies. So, for example, Schmidt, the guy, you are literally referring to the work that Schmidt has done in developing schema theory.
I don't
Everything that's
like to
come
do
out of your
single
mouth.
author referrals, Greg. There are many, many people that have contributed to this work from all kinds of
I know, but
philosophies.
he is the guy that's basically with all the stuff that you're saying comes from him. He's like the guy, right? So even in his own work, part practice was what you're describing as these decontextualized separation of things, produces a 20% performance decrement as it relates to whole practice. Even in his own work, it shows that part practice is a less effective training mechanism than whole practice. Even his own theory says that you need to practice things in a more holistic manner. So you're arguing for science from the 1970s, and you don't realize it.
Yeah.
Look it up yourself, man.
I
Schmidt's
have,
own
man.
work. There's been a meta study of his own stuff
Yeah.
that tells you part practice doesn't work.
I mean, so breaking things down into addressable fractions so that they don't overwhelm you
Yes, that's
is
called
effective.
that's called fractionation.
Okay, yeah, that's the same thing as part practice,
Okay,
Greg.
no, part practice has two types. You
Okay.
have segmentary practice and fractionation. Segmentary practice works a little bit better than fractionation. Fractionation is the least effective type of part practice you can engage in. This was the guy that all the stuff you're talking about, all the science you says works, is the what's told us this. It's not even a competing theory. It's his own work. His own experiments showed that.
I guess you mean competing hypothesis.
Whatever. I'm saying
So
theory as the collected works and the collected explanation for how he says things are happening. There are many hypotheses within this theoretical framework, but his theoretical framework is an assumption on how we use sensory information in short term memory and rehearsal to gain long term memory and transferable skills. So that's
yeah.
his theoretical framework.
Okay, just one last quick thing. So you said that we don't seemingly store like representations of how to move in our head.
Right.
But how does that explain how you can learn skills over time?
Be
Where
more specific.
so you're saying that there's not like anything in the motor cortex or any other part of the brain that tells you how to do a move, like
Right.
specifically blah blah blah. And so how do we know how to do that move better over time if it's not stored somewhere in our brain?
Well, the explanation in direct perception is that it's a relationship, and this relationship becomes more sensitive over time. So there are structural changes that go on in you that increases your capacity to act out in the world. And as this capacity increases and we continue to act out in the world, our search for information sources become more sensitive. So basically, we know how to search, we know where to look, and then all of our movements coordinate into between this relationship of current capacity and search for information. So it's an online modeling system. So basically, we update every time we engage in practice, and the more we do this,
Update
the more
what?
our relationship between us and our environment. So search criteria, action capacity, all these things.
But so you're updating a model that is a model of how to move
No,
already, no?
no, what you're doing is so like I do something, it's stressful enough, my body changes relative to it. So a capacity is built inside the body, whether that be more sensitive neurons, thicker bones, thicker tendons, twitchier muscles, whatever. This changes the system. And then I go back out with it in this new system and I act again. But now I know where to search because I start engaging with the outside world over and over and over again. And as I engage with this outside world and as my capacity changes, there's a relationship that's developed between these two things. And in this relationship, we have a process of attunement, coordination, stabilization, and adaptation. And this is the explanation for why we gain greater skill over time. This also explains why our skills get worse if we don't engage in them. So, since it's not stored and it's only soft assembled, this relationship is deleterious if we don't continue to interact because we lose sensitivity and capacity through lack of interaction.
Isn't
If
that
things were
because the storage degrades to some extent? Like it's not perfect storage, you know?
no, I mean, again, nothing I've read would suggest that storage is what's taking place. I'm not convinced by any argument for storage. I mean,
But how can you possibly know how to do a really good double leg having trained it for years if you're not storing some representational model of how to activate various muscles in coordination to do it?
well,
Like,
the muscles activate relative to the demands of the task. So as I search the space to act out on it, I respond in kind and directly to the demands of the task. Right?
consciously or subconsciously?
Well, that's a deeper debate. We don't know where cognition sits in this
The answer
process.
is subconsciously. It's not a debate. I
Well,
promise you that.
no, well, whatever level of awareness we're operating on, we're not very clear on where that sits relative to movement. It doesn't seem to be conscious in the way we think it does. I can say this: it's not conscious as a central controller is working at like a little joystick. Like it's not like that. It's not like a guy up here sending task demands out throughout the body. Like that's not happening.
for sure. But there is a representation of movements you learn over time in the neural architecture. Like your neurons
No, well,
change how they link to each other so that you know
yes.
things better.
No, so that's capacity. So that's described by structural changes. So it's absolutely true that the neural networks form, that the nerves get thicker, the myelin sheathing gets thicker, the bones, the tendons, everything changes relative to your level of interaction and the stress that's produced by it. But that's just capacity. That doesn't mean you're going to act one way or another, because even with all those capacities built, you could revert back to a beginner if something changes in your, attention, for example. Like this, there's a joke, like if you want to make a golfer lose a game, ask him how he holds his club. Like you can take an expert golfer and turn him back into a beginner real quickly just by changing his focus of attention. So we know that there's a deep relationship between how we attend to our world, our current capacity, and how those two things interact to create a behavior. Even researchers on the other side of what I ascribe to have shown that attention affects performance. So, for example, external focus of attention outside of ourselves produce better performance results than focusing internal to ourselves. So it seems like the information that we use to perform is stuff out there, not stuff in here. And this is even worse for expert performers. What's interesting is if you get people to focus on expert performers to get to focus on things that are closer to their body, their performance goes down. If you get them to focus things that are further from their body, either the results of their actions or some point out in space, their performance goes up. That's interesting. If it was stored, why would attention change things?
The storage is something that's sub or unconsciously executed for you. You're not aware that you have a motor program until you try to move in the world and realize, oh, I'm moving in a way that I learned a ton before. Like you
Yeah,
still need
I don't.
attentional focus, but a lot of the decision making isn't even conscious. Like if someone shoots on you and you sprawl, a lot of times you didn't make the decision to sprawl. It's automatic at that point. It works faster than
Well,
you need to
if that were the
cognitively examine
case,
it.
and you're saying that, then drilling has no effect at all because you just argued for what I'm arguing for. You were
I
saying we
didn't.
sprawled relative to the demands of the task.
Only
And
if you've drilled it a shitload. If not, you're not going to sprawl. You're just going to get taken down.
dude, you've seen people in street fights sprawl. I've seen children sprawl who've never engaged in grappling once in their life.
Yeah. The only question is who sprawls more often, people that have trained it a bunch before or people that have never trained it? And the answer is a bunch before, which proves
Oh,
that
for
training
sure.
it in isolation
Oh yeah.
might have some value.
No. That's another. I mean, other than the other 37 begging the questions, it's another one. I mean, like because someone gets more consistent at doing a behavior doesn't mean drilling is what caused it.
We know drilling can cause people to be more consistent at behavior.
We actually don't want consistency in behavior because what we also note is that when we look at expert performers,
You're
they're
shifting
move.
goalposts, Greg.
No, I don't. I'm making a point. When you look at expert movers, they actually move less consistently than novice performers.
Yes, I understand that nuance. That's a very good point.
Yeah,
They move because they can adjust their basic movement to the demands that they need, but they
right.
have a
So
basic to
if they're
adjust.
adjusting in real time to the demands of the task, how does drilling get us there?
It gives you the framework of what you're doing and you just modify it. For example, if I teach you how to punch pretty well, all the good mechanics of punching, changing the
What are
direction of the
good
punch.
mechanics of punching?
Say what?
What are good mechanics of punching?
Making sure you're not just using your chest and triceps, but putting in your whole body, doing a hip dip and then pushing through your hips, rotating the trunk, just basic stuff. If I teach you how to do that with any kind of punch, and then I teach you, okay, now punch in this direction, now punch in that one, I punch in that one, I'm relying on that basic architecture to express itself more complexly. And thus I elevate the ability to put it into other tasks or other
Right.
applications
So
like
you're
punching
so
there, there,
just
there. But if I don't know how to punch really well, then
yeah.
that's a real big problem for me because I punch into every direction wrong.
Right. Well, so just so you know, I don't know if you know this, but again, just so if you want to read later or look up later, you are arguing for a theoretical framework called schema theory that assumes storage and regurgitation of storage, and you're arguing for adapting storage to new task demands. So you're arguing for an old model of how we think the motor perf- motor skills and performance are produced. So just if you want to go look at that later, that's what you're arguing for. And I'm arguing against that. I'm
I mean,
saying
I
none of
talked
what
to GPT-4 about it.
hey, whatever. I'm just saying if you want to, whatever you want to do, but that's what you're
Sure, but
that's what you,
GPT-4 told me I was right, man. What do you think about that?
well, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're right about schema theory. And I'm saying,
But it said that's
oh,
actually a more effective way to train athletes.
this GPT-4 can say whatever it wants based on what you ask it, but that's not true. If the data it's picking up is that there's more information about schema theory and its functionality, then you're going
Well,
to
it
get
can
that
parse
result.
data. It doesn't just it resolves data all the time. It's
But
a reasoning engine.
it couldn't resolve the current data being discovered right now about CLA versus schema theory because schema theory's been around longer. Just you know, that was the first way we thought about things.
You know, it was
But either
updated
way,
last like a few months ago, so I'm pretty sure it has all that stuff.
eh, but again, you're just arguing for schema theory. And if ChatGPT thinks that schema theory is the way to do things, then so be it. But the studies don't suggest that at all.
Alrighty, I got to run. This is really, really fun. Thanks everyone for hanging in there. Josh, sorry to shut you out the entire time, my friend.
You know what? You needed at least one good-looking guy in here, so I just made sure that I was present. I kept my mouth shut. You guys had some interesting shit to say. I appreciate you both doing this. Yeah, maybe run it back again sometime. Do you guys have any closing thoughts or anything? I'm gonna put this up on my YouTube channel, so if you have, any social media stuff you want people to take a look at or whatever, just give those shouts out now.
No, I'm good. I have
Greg, go
nothing
ahead.
to say.
What
Okay.
was that?
Oh, I said no. I'm good. I have nothing to say.
Yep, I'm good. People know where to find me.
Me too.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, appreciate you guys doing this, and I will catch up with you later.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Bye.